Coming up, medicine gardens and an Indigenous cyclist. We hear from Native leaders making differences in their communities. Plus, we hear the legal update of a sacred site that was demolished near Mount Hood, Oregon. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from Indian country today.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. ASU offers the only online undergraduate digital media literacy degree, teaching students how to recognize and combat inaccuracies on all platforms. They are using cutting-edge tools and tactics to separate fact from fiction in a digital world overloaded with misinformation. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg made a stop in Phoenix to promote the passing of the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. He was greeted by the mayor of Phoenix before taking a tour of a new concourse still under construction at Sky Harbor Airport. The bill includes money to help tribes fix and improve roads, bridges, and other transportation needs. Fresh from the White House Tribal Nations Summit, he acknowledged the concerns about how to spend the money equitably between small and large tribes.
Well, the point about small and large tribes is well taken. Let me mention that programs that we have in our department, like the Tribal Self-Governance Program and others, are going to be reinvigorated thanks to this legislation. Some tribes have more resources than others. This was another theme that many tribal leaders raised at the Tribal Nations Summit earlier this week. And that means we need to make sure that our grants, our processes, our programs are user-friendly, and that we help build capacity in those tribes that are smaller. There are 574 enrolled tribes in the U.S. Not all of them have interstate presence. Not all of them have a staffed Washington office. Not all of them have gaming revenue. There are so many differences among those 574.
The bipartisan infrastructure bill aims to improve many of the country's transportation systems. The secretary's last visit to Arizona in July included a roundtable discussion with tribal leaders. At the top of that address was road safety. In Mexico City, textile artists are showcasing traditional indigenous designs. Thousands of indigenous Mexican artisans gathered last week for a 4-day event filled with culture and music. The festival aims to showcase indigenous textile products and traditional embroidery. This unique embroidery and design have become part of Mexico's visual identity and is becoming increasingly popular abroad. International fashion brands are being called out for using the designs without any benefit to indigenous communities.
We have to call out and make those companies responsible and explain that they cannot copy these products because it affects more than the sale of the products, but relations within the communities and the artisan families.
Organizations say the knockoffs affect more than the sale of the products, but also relations within the communities and artisan families. Education is at the heart of Wayne Mitchell's life's work. He's from the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation and lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Dr. Mitchell is on the board of trustees for the Heard Museum. Last year, he and his wife, Marie, decided to commission a sculpture for the museum. The museum holds a special place for the couple because that's where they had their first date. They asked their clan niece, Elk Woman, to create the art. Marie suggested the theme of treaties due to the historical importance, especially with so many broken treaties. Last Thursday, the sculpture was unveiled. ICT's executive producer, Patty Tholahongva, was there.
Marie and I are donating the sculpture, Honor the Treaties, for you to enjoy and to ponder what the title and the inscribed words mean to you?
He wanted me to do a piece that had to do with honoring the treaties. I just asked that stone because that stone is sacred. It's made up of everything in this world. And so it's holy and it's got all these spirits in there. So I asked them to help me to see what's in there that it could give the best message, to bring something good and make people understand and feel what this is about.
At this time, I would like to ask my wife, Marie, and her curator, Diana Pardue, to unveil the sculpture. It is a reminder of our obligation to ensure that present and future generations of Native voices are celebrated and lifted up. Art is beautiful, as well as inspirational and influential.
The sculpture will be on display inside the library at the Heard Museum. Internationally acclaimed artist Buffy Sainte-Marie can now add a postage stamp to her list of honors. Last week at Canada's National Arts Centre in Ottawa, the Canadian Post unveiled a commemorative stamp of the singer-songwriter. The icon has made a huge impact on the North American Indigenous community with her music and activism. Sainte-Marie says she hopes her latest recognition will open more doors for other Indigenous artists. And those are the headlines for Indian Country Today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Coming up, White House Tribal Youth Forum speaker Anthony Temez is talking about food sovereignty. Plus, Native women ride virtually to bring awareness. Anthony Temez's passions include land-based education and working to ensure that community members can plant medicine gardens in their own backyard. Temez was a featured speaker at the White House Youth Forum where he talked about food sovereignty and land security. He was also a founder of the First Nations Community Garden based in Chicago. Temez has served as a youth ambassador for President Obama's Generation Indigenous Initiative. In 2018, he was recognized by the Center for Native American Youth as a champion for change. Welcome, Anthony.
Hello, thanks for having me.
What kinds of projects have you been working on?
Yeah, so in Chicago, you mentioned that we have the First Nations Garden. And so that is the first time that the city of Chicago has returned land back to the Native community. And that was actually something founded by my brother Adrian and my Aunt Janie, where we can come, the Native community can come and learn about different medicines that we have in traditional foods, but it's also a place where the city of Chicago at-large residents can come and learn about Native culture.
What does food sovereignty mean to you?
I think that food sovereignty is when Native people are able to grow their own medicines without interference from any outside acting force, and we're able to do that freely, right? And so we're able to pass that on generations. So I'm able to pass that on to my brother and my brother's children, and so on and so forth.
We've seen a big push for gardening and farming in recent months, and I would say since the pandemic started, I've definitely seen more gardening videos on social media platforms like TikTok. To you, what does gardening represent, and how does it make you feel?
Yeah, so gardening is just it's a way for people to get outside and get connected with the land that they're living on. I live in the city of Chicago, often referred to as a concrete jungle. So with what little access to land that urban natives do have, we utilize it to the fullest, right? And so we're able to go out there and plant our traditional medicines, right? Before we didn't have a space like this, the First Nations garden, where our medicines and our food were essentially grown, we'd have to travel across the city to several different locations, which can take hours. And so, gardening to me is something that, gets us closer to our roots, but it also, it helps with a plethora of things, right? It helps with mental health. It helps with teaching younger generations. It helps with teaching older generations, right? It's going back to that traditional way of learning, that horizontal way of learning from each other.
What kinds of medicines and foods are you growing now in Chicago, given that the weather, of course, is getting colder?
Yeah, so now we're coming into winter, so it's the end of fall. So we're harvesting a lot of our squash if it hasn't already been harvested. A lot of our four medicines, sage, sweetgrass, cedar, and arsema. Those the time to harvest those has already came and went. So now we're at the stage of drying everything and being able to hand it out to our community members.
And tell us more about the First Nations Garden. On average, how many people come to visit? How many people help and to volunteer?
Yeah, I would say that there is a probably a steady 10 people that come on the regular who kind of manage or steward the garden. Um, and then on the regular, depending on the week, it could be, anywhere from 20 people to 100 people. Recently, we were able to host a neighborhood school, and they were able to come to the garden and they got a tour and they were able to learn about some of the native plants that are in the area and hear from Native people in the community.
That's a great segue into my next question, which is what is the reaction from non Native people who visit the garden or learn about the garden? I imagine that to Native people, gardening and farming is something that a lot of us grew up with, but what is the reaction from non Native individuals?
Yeah, initially, I would say in the beginning, the surrounding community was kind of hesitant because it was before it was just an empty lot where a lot of community members just let their dogs run around and use as the restroom. So we had to do a lot of cleaning up in that sense. But with time, we have grown, relationships with a lot of the people who live in the surrounding community, which is Albany Park, but also with some of the elected officials that are in the area and the Chicago community at large. And so they know that they can come to this garden and use it as a resource for them, their family, or their students. Again, to just learn about Native culture. And we're very Chi Nations Youth Council and the First Nations Garden are very intentional about letting people know when they're able to come into the space and ask any questions that they may have, whether it pertain to gardening or farming, or if they just have a question about the Native community of Chicago.
Anthony Temez, thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
When we come back, we learn about a bike ride raising awareness for an important cause, plus more from Oregon on a sacred site that was destroyed. Stay with us. Guarena Lopez is the founder of Native Women Ride, which is a virtual community that gives exposure to Indigenous cyclists. She is based in Washington, D.C., and recently rode to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to pay tribute to the Native children that were taken to that federal Indian boarding school. Welcome, Karina.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell us about your ride.
So my friend, Cindy Ginny Russell, he's Navajo. He and I rode from Washington, D.C. to the Carlisle Indian Boarding School to honor the children that are still buried there and also survivors.
And how long was this ride?
So initially we planned the ride, it was 190 miles. And then we did have some detours. So it ended up being about 220 miles. And in the time that I had done my research, I found out that there were about 190 children that were buried there. And so when we added the extra miles and then when we actually arrived, we found out that there were about 220 children that had been buried there in the history of Carlisle.
How long did it take you to bike these 220 miles?
It took us 4 days. We rode the first 100 miles on the C&O Canal, which is a paved path. And then we had to cut through the Micho Forest to get to Carlisle. And we arrived in Carlisle the night before we went. And then the morning of arriving to the cemetery, we rode another 20 miles.
Riding 220 miles over the course of 4 days, I imagine, is very taxing emotionally. And the fact that you were dedicating this ride to the Native children, I understand, could add even another level to that. Can you tell us what kinds of emotions were going through yourself as you were doing this journey?
Sure. So initially it was just, I was overwhelmed by the practicalities of planning and making sure that myself and the other cyclists, there were two to three more who had participated with us in the first 2 days. So just a little bit of stress at first, making sure we had food and water and places to stop. And then once we kind of got on our way and we passed the 100-mile mark, then I would say it was just myself and Cindy for the last 2.5 days. We both had started to feel, the physical exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion, and then we rode our longest day, which was 70 miles at about 4,000 feet elevation. And I think I definitely hit a wall emotionally. It was hard. I was tired. And I was thinking about every morning we dedicated that day to about 40 or 50 children. And it was really hard. I got to know the children's names. And the nations that they're from in my 10 to 12 years of researching Carlisle. And so when I would dedicate the miles to them in the morning, I would say a prayer and I would say their names to myself to invoke their spirit and really to honor them in that way.
And why was it important to you to honor these children?
My dad was a survivor of the Catholic schools. He didn't board away, but he did go to Catholic institutions. And so I grew up, unfortunately, with the residue of that experience. And a lot of the people that I knew also had that experience as well. And when I moved to DC, I was working at the American Indian Museum, and I discovered in the archives this photographs, essentially, of children at the boarding schools. And it just totally shifted my understanding of how widespread the boarding schools really were in the US. And since then, I have been vigorously researching them to try to really understand how theft of children and theft of land and culture and ceremony is connected.
We only have about a minute left, but I want to give you the opportunity to tell us what is the main takeaway about federal Indian boarding schools. I know they've been in the news recently, but what's the one thing that you want people to know?
Well, I want people to know that that our communities are thriving, right? There's a lot of trauma that I think people want us to perform. And the amazing thing that I think that is repeated often throughout our communities is that we have joy, that we are reenacting our sovereignty in all these different ways where, through language, through food, through ceremony. And so, I think that it's just our way to survive, that we know that that's part of our heritage, really our lineage. And that for non-Native people who don't know about the boarding and residential schools, this is a time for them to become our accomplices, to really commit to understanding not just about the boarding schools, but their the legacy and the impact of how they have affected our communities. And so then when they see us as land defenders or water protectors or fighting for things that, that really impact our communities, they can understand how it is all connected.
Mhm. Guarina Lopez, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
In 2008, the federal government destroyed a sacred site near Mount Hood in Oregon, located some 70 miles away from Portland. It happened when the state wanted to widen a highway. They bulldozed into a place where tribal leaders say has religious meaning to them. That incident has turned into a years-long legal battle. ICT and Underscore reporter Chris Adlin joins us now to tell us more about the case, Slockish versus U.S. Federal Highway Administration. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Leah. Good to be back.
Set the stage for us. What is the legal battle at hand?
So it's like you kind of summarized it pretty well. In 2008, it's a small site, less than an acre in size, that was just off of US Highway 26 near Mount Hood. That was in a kind of a larger area that had been used since time immemorial. For as a kind of a pass through for indigenous people going to hunt and gather food. And in the area in question, the tribal leaders who have kind of sued the federal government have said this is an area where people were buried, and there's a rock altar that was destroyed, and it's been used by these tribal leaders, elders, and hereditary chiefs as a place of where they've practiced their traditional religious practices. So
this lawsuit came after the sacred site was destroyed. Tell us more about that.
So the government has said that they did consult with some of the tribes with ties to the region, like the Yakama Nation. However, the plaintiffs in the case, the hereditary chiefs and the tribal elder, said that they weren't consulted or given enough kind of heads up. And to go back real quick, the government in the 1980s had kind of protected this area because of its potential historic and cultural significance, but has said that in the end that nobody's found any burial sites or anything like that were in need of protecting, and the tribal governments have agreed. However, just before the bulk of the work began on this widening project, this group of plaintiffs really began to raise alarm and say that they really hope this site can be protected because it's irreplaceable, and it's really important to them, and them passing on those practices and that culture and preserving that space.
Because the site was destroyed, there's nothing that can be done to replace it. But my understanding is now that tribal leaders want to rehabilitate the site, and they want the federal government to be responsible for rehabilitating the site. What does that look like? What are they asking for?
So yeah, here this is kind of this has been a point that the two sides have tried to negotiate over and come to an agreement or a compromise without having to continue to pursue this through the courts. What the tribal leaders want to see is them to have access to the site again, trees to be replanted, and the stone, this river rock altar that they say marked and signified an area of burial sites to be restored. But the government says that says a couple things that that it's out of their hands. There's nothing they can do. One being that nobody knows what happened to those important rocks that were used as an altar. and the other being, that they've said that they don't have any control over management of that site. They have said there's nothing they can do. It's actually the state of Oregon in the Oregon Department of Transportation that controls that site, which would be responsible or able to kind of remove any earthen berms that have covered up medicinal plants and areas of worship, replant trees to replace the old growth Douglas fir that were taken down for the project. And the Oregon Department of Transportation was dismissed from the case because they have sovereign immunity. So, the government is saying, the federal government is saying that, this is a moot case and there's nothing they can do. Their hands are tied. So.
We only have about 30 seconds left, Chris, but tell us what's next for this case. When do we suspect a ruling will come?
So this was heard in front of the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we're just waiting on a ruling. And this will probably coincide very closely in timing with a kind of a similar case involving the potential destruction of a sacred Apache site. And that case was heard by the same court last month, and a ruling is expected in that case sometime early next year. So, we could see, a ruling in this case, in that same time frame, so right around then.
Chris Adlin, thank you.
Thanks.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news and updates, visit us anytime at IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing
This is Indian Country Today.